So welcome to Junior College Night, October 21st, 2021. We wanted to do these types of events because in the past we've kind of pushed all the classes into like this singular college night in the fall, and that's not particularly useful, I think, in many ways, because there are a lot of questions that are really, really, really specific to a specific point in a student's high school career. And so we've split this up. We'll have sophomore and freshman night in November. So if you have another student, definitely jump in for those because the content will differ. Some of it's going to stay the same, but it will change based off the student's class there and the advice that we're giving. So keep that in mind. A quick overview of what we're going to cover. So what matters, what schools are looking for when assessing applications is what we're going to start with. I think that's what a lot of families are always really curious about and what they should be focusing on, what's important, what's not. Next to that, we're going to be kind of giving a quick rundown of our school profile. The school profile was just added to the website. It's been updated for this academic year. We'll probably be sending that out in an e-blast as well. So I'll go through the slides really quickly. It's going to be pretty small, so you may not be able to read everything. That's perfectly fine. You can go to the website and find that. I'll probably have them, when they send out the recordings for this, attach the school profile as well, so you can look through that on your own time. We'll talk about competitive colleges and the statistics of students who go there. I think this is really important to actually see where Riverdale students are going and what their metrics are. That remember Carolyn Sachs will become clear in a little bit. It is something that I often tell students in the consulting process. And so what I mean by that will be detailed there. Then we'll look at considerations just for 2023 and your class specifically, and kind of the things that I think that you should be keeping in mind. Standardized testing is kind of a big question, I think, on everybody's mind. So we'll detail that a little bit. I've got a lot of data to present regarding standardized testing that it's kind of just been presented at NACAC, which is the National College Association of Counselors, which I was just at a conference in Seattle for. We'll talk a little bit about Naviance, which is what we use for applications, and then how students can interact with colleges now. So busy schedule. A lot of the stuff we'll try to go through quickly. As I said, we are recording. I will share my slides at the end of this, so you'll probably get that tomorrow morning or so. So just be aware that if I rush through a slide a little bit too quickly, you will have access to that at another point in time. So the first question usually is, what are schools looking for, right? What is important in terms of the application, right? And the best data that we have to go on that comes from NACAC itself, and that was the National Association of College Admissions Counselors. They do a survey every few years of colleges where they talk to college admissions professionals and get their opinion on what was important for that application round. So we actually get to see the data there. It is important to note that is 2018 to 2019. So notice the standardized testing that comes in fourth there on that list. That is likely to fall, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. But in terms of the importance that's attached, I think that for some institutions, it's become a lot less important. For others, it's kind of solidified its importance. But I would expect that would fall a little bit further down the list. So be aware of that, 2018 to 2019. So the first three sections are usually what attracts most people's attention: that grades in all courses, grades in college prep courses, and the strength of the curriculum. And to kind of figure that stuff out, schools are provided with those two things. They're provided with the students' transcripts, and they're provided with a school profile, which we'll look at here in a second. And both of those kind of detail what the school is about, how your student has done in the school, what classes that student has enrolled in, what type of rigor that student has embraced, and the like there. The difference between the all courses and college prep courses is that college prep courses are going to be typically your core coursework, so math, science, history, etc. But there are certain events in which a student is applying, particularly for engineering, for instance, or for art, or for English literature. And suddenly those college prep courses become a little bit more relevant as it is relevant to the field in question there. So if you're applying for engineering, maybe your B plus in English is going to matter a lot less than if you're applying for English literature, so to speak. So typically the transcripts and school profile will make up those first three. In addition to that, the teacher recommendations will be huge. So especially if you're applying to private colleges, most public colleges, and again, it's most, do not want teacher recommendations. There are many exceptions to that, as there will be to a lot of those kind of grandiose statements of colleges don't want this. So University of Michigan, University of Texas, for instance, will want teacher recommendations. But for the most part, teacher recommendations are going to those private colleges. And they do matter. There will also be some confusion sometimes between the school profile and the school report. The school report is also connected with the counselor recommendation. And that's what I myself write. I'm writing it for students right now. It's taking up all my time this next week. So the school report is kind of a report on how your student compares to the rest of their class, right? So I'm asked to rank them in terms of academics, in terms of extracurriculars, in terms of personal characteristics and the like there. And it's, a reference point that's taking kind of a bird's eye view of where everybody else in the class is at the time. And the counselor recommendation is actually attached to that. So sometimes they're just combined as one thing on college admissions websites. And that's, I walk around, hopefully I get to know your student by then, but I walk around and talk to all staff and teachers, anybody that has something to say, and I try to include that in that letter to provide, again, that bird's eye perspective of a student's progression at Riverdale. There's also a counselor survey that I send out. Most of our seniors are filling that out right now. So you can tell me anything about yourself, maybe why you had bad grades for a specific trimester or something like that. So it's your chance to kind of be heard through my voice as well. So, and then your schedule for senior year. So obviously when we're submitting your applications, they already have your junior year, which you're involved in right now. It is kind of your last chance if you're applying early action, early decision to get your grades in, right? So if you're really trying to boost your grades and you want to make those EA, early action or early decision deadlines, you got to do it junior year, right? There's a chance that your grades for first trimester senior year will end up making it to your colleges in time, but there's also a chance it won't, that they've already have decided at that point, right? So that's why junior year is incredibly important. It is quite likely the last set of grades that they're going to kind of remember you by. So, and again, if you have a question on anything, please just drop it in the chat. So the school profile, this is one of the first things that I wanted to do when I started at Riverdale. The old school profile looked like it was from the 90s. It was really, really antiquated. So we modernized it a lot, added a ton of information in there. As you can see, we profiled the whole school, our grading system, what our graduation requirements are. We clearly state that we're not an AP school. We talk about our honors coursework in there. Based off of some school advice from NACAC 2, we've also included now a full detail of our math progression is on there so that schools are better able to understand where students are in terms of that math progression route. We detail senior year, what exactly Senior X is, our most difficult senior classes, as well as that COVID-19 information there at the bottom to let people know that we went past no pass for that one trimester and then return to letter grades thereafter. So that's generally pretty important to people. It is represented there. The COVID-19 stuff is also represented somewhere else in a document that they receive. So just be aware that that's there. The school report happens when you're applying. So it's not even sent until you've actually submitted your application. It's what I'm filling out for students right now, right? So it's a very good question. It's nothing to worry about at this exact moment, but it's good to know that it's coming up. And it's important to that you know them to represent them. I would say it's not essential. I mean, like when I first started, we had a great senior body, and and application results. I talk to teachers constantly and get their feedback if I don't really know a student, and there are a few seniors this year that just haven't been in a lot, which is fine. And I feel like I've gotten to know them by their teachers, right? With that said, yeah, it's more personable. I usually have a better story to tell, right? There's a lot more life to it when I do know the student. So just be aware of that. But yeah, I still think I do a pretty good job even when I don't really know the student that well on a personal level. We also include our acceptances. Most colleges don't really look at that stuff, just so you're aware. But it's important for our community, so we have it in there where our students are attending. We'll be looking at that a little bit more closely here in a second, so just be aware. As I said, this is on our website. We'll also be sharing a link probably in the email with these slides. So I ended up deciding not to go with our SAT, ACT statistics on the school profile, as is usually common, mainly because we just didn't have a lot of students that took it. I felt that it was too small of a sample size and would generally be unfair to a lot of students because generally the strongest students took that test. And so suddenly a lot of kids would be looking the worse off there. So we ended up going with a different kind of presentation of those statistics. Namely our four-year college acceptance rate, which is sitting right, last year was 95% for the class of 2021. Just to put that in comparison, most of our peers, public high schools, are probably about 20 to 30 percentile lower than that for four-year acceptance. That's right at the private level. Some of the private schools will hit 100. That's probably just not possible for a public high school, to be honest, which is perfectly fine. But yeah, 95% was astounding last year. In two-year college, 5%. We are focusing mainly on 4 years tonight, but keep in mind that 2 years are a really good option. We've had some students that just, especially financially, knew that was the better route. They intend to go to very specific schools and know exactly where they want to be. But the community college is just an important stepping stone for them for financial reasons. So the middle 50% GPA was 3.48 to 3.94. And this surprised a lot of people. The average number of honors classes was just 7. And that's for all 4 years, not even just the 3 years with which they applied. So if we looked at the average transcript, some students were 0, right? Some students had a lot more, as what we're about to see. But the average number sat there right around 7. So if your student's doing more than that, they are already above average. So I wanted to pick out some schools and then talk about what it takes to kind of go to the next level, because this is important for a lot of families as they're making decisions and constructing their lists. So looking at a very specific subset of that student body and where they went to school, one of the things that I've been trying to be very upfront about is that unique college attendance. I think that schools can get in these positions where they have a really talented student that gets into 10 really incredible schools, and then they advertise that as, oh, we got students into Harvard, into Yale, into Stanford, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really just one kid that got into all of those, right? And so I really try to steer to those unique college acceptances or attendances, meaning that there's actually a student at these schools, right? This is where they're attending right now, right? So that that it's a presentation of not one kid, but lots of kids. Okay. So our full gamut there. So we had a lot of popularity with the Boston area, as is normal there. So Boston University, Carleton, we ended up sending 2 students to, had 3 accepted. Same with Northeastern, which is always really popular with Riverdale kids. I will say that each Riverdale class has its own personality, and it is interesting in the sense of how they migrate to particular schools, right? There are a few schools that a lot of kids are applying to this year that we haven't had students apply to in 3 or 4 years, right? So it really does depend sometimes on the personality characteristics of that senior class as well. Northeastern was really popular last year. Boston was really popular, and the like. The new advanced physics elective with AP testing, how might this support? Yeah, we can talk a little bit about AP testing towards the end too. But yeah, having an AP score is just an extra added benefit there. So I'll try to include that a little bit of thoughts on that towards the end though. So we had some, pretty good acceptances. Generally, this is 1 in 5 students then ended up at a sub 20% acceptance rate college there or university. We honestly had students that are above the metrics that you're about to see that didn't even apply to any schools that were sub 20% as well, right? And that's one of the big things that we'll be emphasizing is fit in a little bit and not just kind of trying to get, a very, very, very competitive school so that you can brag to everybody about, right? The stats for these students sat a little bit higher, right? So the average GPA there of those kids was 3.95 with a range of 3.84 to 4.0. Honors classes, the average was 16. One student was down as low as 6 though, and one was as high as 23 was the highest student that we had there in those applications. So in terms of really, really competitive schools, that may give you a little bit of a better baseline of who is getting into those places. Though, again, not necessarily because some students just don't even apply to that range, right? So you do have to keep that individual choice in mind. And parents are always talking about how college acceptances have changed over the years, right? It's so different from when you applied. And I really wanted to give a visual representation of that as well, because it is very, very true, right? And a lot of people are really surprised by this data right here. So back in 1990, the acceptance rate at University of Chicago sat around 77 to 78%, right? If you were looking at Stanford, it was about 22%, meaning that virtually 1 in 4 students that applied to Stanford were accepted at that point. And that is very different from now, obviously. You see those numbers have fallen quite a lot, right? And this is from their actual school data. So University of Chicago sits closer to 6%. So they've gone from 77% to 6% over that 30 years. Northwestern started off right there around 42 and is now right around that 8 or 9%. Stanford, legendary for that dip there. So they went from 22, I think, to about 4.8, I think is what they range at. And then Harvard had its most competitive year this year, and I think they were 3.4 or something acceptance rate. They were originally 17%. So your odds were definitely much better if you were applying in 1990. So, when you hear about kids getting into these colleges these days, it is very different when you heard in the 90s about kids getting into these colleges. It is so much more difficult to do so, right? And you really do have to keep that in mind during the application process, right? Especially because University of Chicago is probably about as competitive as, say, University of Oregon, maybe, right? Or Oregon State at this time. So just keep that in mind. It's also a good reminder that acceptance rate is not necessarily indicative of quality, right? Just because it is a school with a 15% acceptance rate does not mean it is a great school, right? Or the perfect school for you, right? There are great schools with much higher rates than that. So, and that brings up my point with Remember Carolyn Sachs. I'm going to drop a link here in the chat. If you guys would like to read the PDF, I really recommend it. So Carolyn Sachs is a chapter in Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath. And the big point of Carolyn Sachs was the question, is it better to be a little fish in the big pond or the big fish in the little pond? And it told the story of Carolyn Sachs. I believe she was at Harvard, and she ended up dropping out of her major of choice, which was in a STEM field, simply because it was too competitive for her. And the statement I think she gives there is that her life would have been a lot better if she had just chosen the University of Maryland, right, instead of Harvard. She would have graduated with the degree she wanted and would have excelled there. And so even though she had the chops to get into one of those schools, it necessarily wasn't the right fit there. which brought up some data. So a really good comparison point to echo that. So this is again in Gladwell. I'm going to go over it briefly. You can read about this a little bit more. And he was comparing Harvard with Hartwick, which is really just down the street from Harvard there. So you have an 80% acceptance versus a 4% acceptance rate, and the differences between the student bodies there. So at Harvard, they split these STEM degrees up. And when you look at their SAT math scores, they're quite high, right? And I'd expect to see this very similar to what it is now. It's come up probably a pinch in the last 8 years or so since Gladwell published that book. But that's pretty close. So you have, the top third of the class there was at a 753. The middle third was a 674. So 753 would be 99th percentile. Bottom one third at 581. Whereas Hartwick, right, their top third is less than the bottom third at Harvard in terms of the overall math scores, right? And I think that's telling to the type of students that Hartwick is accepting there. So a fundamental difference, right? So the top third at Hartwick had lower scores than the bottom third at Harvard. But the telling thing is this right here. So when it came to the STEM degrees and the people that actually completed those STEM degrees, what do we find? Well, we find that only really 53% of that top group ended up with the degree that they wanted, the degree that they came to the school for, right? So they decided they wanted to go to Harvard for engineering, right? Or for biology or for chemistry. Only 53% of the kids actually ended up walking out with a STEM degree there. When it came to the bottom third, you have a much, much, much lower rating there of 15.4%. And so you would expect, take a guess for a second about the stats. I think this is the important realization. So you look over at Hartwick then with an 80% acceptance rate, and you're like, well, hold on, their top third, right, is lower than the bottom third at Harvard. So presumably they would probably have a comparable rate in terms of how many people are actually getting those STEM degrees at Hartwick, getting the degree that they actually came to the school for. And what do we find out? Well, we actually find out that the numbers are identical, right? In terms of the top third, it was about 55%, 27% for the middle, and 17% for the bottom, meaning that the stronger students, who would have been the weaker student at Harvard, end up progressing through the route that they wanted to at that lower tier university, right? And this is that little fish in a big pond versus big fish in a little pond idea here. And Malcolm Gladwell does a great job expounding kind of the implications of this. But one of the things, students really need to be mindful of is that they're going to a school often for a specific degree program that they're interested in. And kind of the success of graduating from that university should also include getting the degree that you originally wanted, right? And not necessarily having to abandon that for some other degree because you found that it was too hard, right? And so sometimes fit does not necessarily mean going to the name brand institution there. So we do keep that in mind in our consulting. I don't think that by throwing out a lot of big names, we're really just pushing those types of schools. It's something that we really, really, really are mindful when making recommendations of schools to look at, and also steering kids towards specific opportunities there. So a few considerations that are unique to just the class of 2023. And some of these will be broadened out to freshmen and sophomores as well. But the big thing would be grades. So at the time you ended up breaking for COVID, right? You only really had 2 trimesters of grades in, and then suddenly you have this no pass trimester. And then you have a full year of online learning. And schools kind of don't know what to make of that year, right? Understandably. I mean, even schools that know Riverdale well and know our grading policies and the like, how do you compare the online side with all the other stuff that we've done in the past? And so one of the things I really want to stress for a lot of kids is that this can either be an opportunity, kind of a continuation of the narrative, in the sense that if you were online and you were getting all A's or A's and B's and you were doing really, really, really well, this first trimester and the remaining part of this year is a way to continue that narrative so that when somebody looks bird's eye view at your transcript, there's no question. It's just simply, oh, online doing well, in person doing well, I guess this is just a good student, right? But it's also an opportunity for a change of narrative because quite honestly, we did have some students struggle, right? And so you can clearly, it's stated on our school profile when we went to in person, if you were in that BC or CD territory, you know, suddenly pivoting and being in that B territory or AB territory or all A territories can really sell that narrative of online education was not for you. You've turned a new corner with being back in person in your actual classes there. The worst thing that can happen is for you to go from that online and just slack it this trimester, next trimester, and the like, right? Because if you end up with B's and C's, whether it's that continuation of the narrative or the change in narrative, it's not there. The story isn't there at that point, right? And so they're going to be using this year to make sense of last year, right? And setting the context there. So keep that in mind as they're as you're going through your classes. I know we have about another month left there. Another thing is getting re-involved. You know, you were freshmen at the time, and then you just suddenly are completely isolated, right? And now you're kind of thrown back into this in-person environment. And it is an interesting, you know, perspective from a college admission standpoint because, you know, in a year or 2 years, you're going to be thrown into a college, right? And it's an interesting feature for students to see how well they're going to adapt to that environment and whether they're going to take the steps to find a specific community in that school, right? And so that getting re-involved and trying to find opportunities to engage with the broader school community, whether it's through sports or through a club or whether it's through a specific service opportunity, it really tells schools a lot that you're taking and kind of seizing those opportunities, even if you were missing out on a lot before. And creativity. So those students that were into those top schools, I mean, some of the ideas that those guys came up for service hours on their own, right? And learning opportunities was just astounding, right? Some of the seniors this year coming to me and saying, like, I need more challenge during this online period and us finding college courses or looking at AP tests to take, right? It was stunning, right? And I really think that we've seen some of our strongest students thrive by them kind of taking the lead on either finding the opportunities themselves or finding somebody to help them find those opportunities. So please, please, please reach out to me, reach out to our other counselor, Krista Trepka, to find that type of stuff if you are interested or if you think that something may be interesting there to pursue. So. And another one I want to emphasize the continuation of hobbies. A lot of students picked up quirky things, which are just incredible, right? Some students picked up woodworking, or I had a student last year that fell in love with painting and literally had never painted in his entire life, right? Another student that's doing 3D printing of like actual replicas of airports right now. Quirky hobbies in some ways, but it shows a lot of personality, right? And continuing with that type of stuff, A, may give you something to talk about in an essay, but two, it really kind of sells you as a much more well-rounded person than just somebody that's making good grades, right? So I'd really encourage you, if you picked up a hobby over that, if you're knitting, if you are lifting weights, if you are somehow got interested in coding or something like that, continue that hobby. Don't just abandon it now that we're back in person and that time has gotten a little bit more, regulated with school. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Thanks, Jim. That was great. Yeah, absolutely. Other counselor. So definitely shoot her an email. She's great. Really, really encourage you to reach out. Now the big data, a lot of us want, right? So this was interesting to me. As you can probably tell from the other stuff, I'm really data driven. I really like statistics. So sitting in this presentation was incredible. The presentation that I'm going to give data from is not my own. So this comes from a presentation at NACAC, which was, again, a conference up in Seattle. There were about 3,000 of us in person there at NACAC. Crazy they haven't even had a COVID outbreak among that group. And really telling, I think, of the policies that they put in place for that event. But tons and tons of incredible presentations, but this is probably one of the most memorable. Pragmatic Discourse on Test Optional Admissions. It was done by Ben Neely. I think he was a math teacher for, it was either 10 or 20 years in the Bay Area. And then he started Revolution Prep, which is one of the main online standardized test prep companies. So he did a presentation. He joined up with Ed Devine. Ed Devine used to be at Lafayette College. He's now at Xavier. So he has been kind of a West Coast rep for probably about 20 years as well. He's now, he lives in Hawaii. Xavier allowed him to move there, which is, I think a great opportunity. So he gets to oversee the West Coast from there. And then Rosemary Martin is the director of college counseling over at St. John's High School, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. I think it's about 150 years old, the high school there. So anyway, they did this, a really helpful presentation where they examined a lot of data from schools. But it is going to be very limited, and I'm going to emphasize this, right? Yeah, I'll answer Robert's question real quickly. Honors does not affect GPA. We do not weight GPAs whatsoever, right? So honors will be your kind of embracing rigor there. Good question, Robert. I can talk about that a little bit more at the end if you'd like. So of the 300 schools who went test optional and were researched for the study, only 21 have actually released admissions data. So actually given the data to the researchers to study there. So again, it is limited. You would expect, given the schools that have released that data, that it's fairly indicative of the lot. But keep it in mind, just 21 schools, we're going to see all of that data here. They distinguish between a school that was test neutral. And so in this sense, a student can choose to submit scores and they're not going to be disadvantaged if they don't, right? So if you don't submit them, you're not going to be in trouble. They're not going to discount you. They're not going to ding you in any way. And then submitted test scores contributed minimally or not at all to the admissions decision. One interesting policy that some schools have put in place is having initial readers. So they put groups that are not on the admissions team to kind of look at the standardized testing data of applications that were coming in. And if the score was well out of what that school would generally consider, then even if they submitted test scores, the reader would just push them to the side and they would pretend that that person did not submit test scores. So you could submit a score that was 200 points lower than the average student to that school, and it would never have even made it to the admissions team, right? And so obviously there you are not disadvantaged, right, from the lack of scores or the presence of scores. Now, having a abnormally high score may actually end up helping you a little bit towards the end, but the key point there is not by much. Then you had test aware, and this is more, I think, what most people thought when we heard test optional, that this is what it would be. So students who choose to submit scores may be disadvantaged if the score is a lot lower, substantially lower than the range. So if you're looking at a school that's 1,300 to 1,400 for their middle 50 and you submit a 1,200, you may be disadvantaged to a certain extent, right? Strong scores may give you a slight advantage. So if again, that 1,300 to 1,400, if you submitted a 1,580 on the SAT, so that 99th percentile, then it's probably going to give you a little bit of a bump in terms of admissions likelihood. And a lack of score submission is a slight detractor. There are probably a lot of regional considerations based off of this, and I'll talk about that here in a second, but just a slight detractor. And then you have test preferred, and this is what everybody feared that test optional actually means, right? So student scores are preferred components, and if you don't submit them, you are at a disadvantage at that point. And if you don't submit them, they're going to be asking, questions. Why wouldn't this person have submitted, right? Where did the student live? Were, test centers open at that point in time? Why did the student not take it? And they were a key component or a key driver when making an admissions decision. So either that lack of score or the score itself. Right? And again, this is what everybody didn't want test optional to be, but the reality is that a lot of schools are in that range. So in the first group, that test neutral, so what you're looking at here is you have the overall admit rate of the school, how many students they accepted, and then looking at that, how much of an advantage the standardized test actually provided. Northeastern was great, 0%. Two of our students that applied there had really good scores and submitted. One student just wasn't able to take it, so did not submit. So yeah, I mean, it didn't help, it didn't hurt is the point there. The big one I was surprised about was USC. USC loves to chase rankings a little bit. The SAT, ACT is kind of captured in some of those rankings sometimes, but here it really did not provide much of a benefit in terms of submitting your scores at USC. But these are, incredibly popular schools. I would say Northeastern, Boston, USC, and Fordham are some of the most popular schools for Riverdale students every year, right? So good to know that they are there. Oops. You also, on the test aware, have University of Georgia. Georgia requires standardized testing, so that's obviously why that's there. Tufts, Amherst, Bucknell, and the like there. Now, it's a minor bump in terms of your likelihood to get in, right, is the reality there. And then the class everybody wants to see, and it's a big one in terms of this. These schools, you really needed to submit standardized testing. For our seniors this year, this has informed some of the ways in which we've constructed our lists. If a student was primarily applying to schools on the right-hand side, for instance, and didn't have very many that weren't on that list, or schools like the ones on the right, then it was, and they didn't have test scores, it was probably a good idea to add some more schools that we thought were going to be test neutral, test aware. But in terms of you deciding whether to take standardized testing, I think this is a way to stress that you probably still should attempt to do so, right? It was funny, as I was prepping these slides, Emory sent out an email to me, and they're doing a big test, what is test optional admissions at Emory discussion. Maybe they caught wind of this presentation. I can't speak to their policy this coming year, but the past year, 123% advantage factor there is astounding. So you were at a huge disadvantage if you did not submit test scores. Same with Georgia Tech. So keep that in mind. A few confounding factors though, and this could be a little bit of a bummer. Admit rates are deceiving and are often much more lower than advertised. So athletes and Pell Grants and demographic admits are something to keep in mind. So, I mean, if we go back to Notre Dame, which has roughly about, 2,000 students that are coming in, or sorry, 1,000 students that are coming in, with a yield of about 53%. Think of all the athletes that are going into Notre Dame. I think their incoming class for first-gen college students was something like 23% this year. Now, athletes, first-gen college students, those are the ones that are least likely to submit test scores. Those are the ones that Notre Dame is prioritizing accepting. So when it comes to, the middle-class demographic, right, non-athletes, the numbers actually may be a lot higher than we're actually seeing here, the advantage there. So that's also a good thing to keep in mind in terms of overall admit rates. Those admit rates do really come down. They're a little bit biased because of the volume of students that are being admitted because of representation either as an athlete or as a first-gen student or as a minority. So keep that in mind. But it doesn't take account into regional differences. So, most of our students had a really, really hard time. I think the average, test cancellations was about 3 for most kids. Everybody wanted to take the test. They just couldn't take the test. And I think, they look at the West Coast and they see that was a, pretty common problem, and you were excused for that, right? If you had lived in Florida, probably not so much, or New York. where most of the testing was occurring after everything opened up back again. So it does probably take into regional differences, take into account the regional differences. At this point, especially in the spring, most test centers are going to be going. So again, I really do think that it's good to target at least a test to see how you do. If you end up not doing well, then you will have that option of not submitting. And it's fair to assume that there's a greater dependency on testing for some majors. MIT, for instance, not on the list, but we could put them for the test advantage. They're definitely test preferred. Georgia Tech would be, kind of a similar school there. There does seem to be a strong correlation at those schools between SAT math scores and how students are doing in engineering and computer science and those fields there. So it is still important to them. They will likely go back to requiring standardized testing as soon as, as soon as either this year ends or next year. So. And then I also wanted to note that schools did see a greater application rate. It's why Harvard dropped to like 3.4 in terms of acceptance rate. A lot of students, when they were, would be choosing schools, they would look at the average GPA and they'd be like, man, I'm dinged there because I'm lower. And they'd look at the average test score and they're dinged there. And so they had these two dings, and that kind of kept them from applying to those schools. But as soon as it became test optional, you eliminated one of them. And so now there's just one thing that's wrong with their application as they see it, right? And it's just the slightly lower GPA. And so then they ended up taking a lot more risks in this application pool. And those students, again, are the ones that so they're already below the average in GPA. They're not submitting test scores. So it may be a lot of those students that are also getting rejected. So that could be, not necessarily indicative of the test scores, but all the other things that usually come alongside that as well. So keep that in mind. But in general, I do think that it does make sense to assume that these schools provide some, there is some benefit to doing standardized testing for those testing preferred schools. How do you, a good question that somebody asked in senior college night is, how do you know, right? Well, if a school's been test optional for longer, they're probably really test optional if they've had 4 or 5 years to do it. University of Chicago is great about this. They've been test optional. They were one of the first elite universities to go test optional. So, I mean, when they say they're test optional, they really are test optional, right? So the longer a school has been doing it. Another key question is, have they changed some of the language on their website? Georgetown's application, at least last year, I don't think I've seen it this year, but last year still said you had to submit SAT, ACT scores, even though you didn't, even though they were test optional. And they were just refusing to go in and change the application because they're going to go back to requiring test scores as soon as they can, right? So schools like that are definitely going to be testing preferred, right? But the longer that they are test optional, the more likely they are really, really test optional. So yeah, and I should note too, Amherst is a pretty good comparison point. Amherst became test aware. They had their most diverse class they have ever had in their history. It was something like 46% of non-white students. They just sent an email, it was either yesterday or the day before, that they have eliminated legacy admissions now. So they are now no longer considering legacy in terms of application pools. They will probably remain test optional. And I think as they do this a little bit longer, they'll become closer to that test neutral range. So. Which brings us to Naviance. So if your student was on campus in the spring, we did a bunch of events called Spring Seminar, where a lot of us went into classes and talked about different things. So one of the things I really wanted to do my first year at Riverdale, and it was disrupted by COVID, was to get everybody in Naviance. I think previous counselors really just used it for the end of junior year and senior year. It's what we use for kids to apply to colleges. I really wanted to get people in it a lot earlier so they could begin exploring colleges. And I had a big meeting with our rep from Naviance. We ended up upgrading our account a lot. And we've got a lot of really cool new features that I'm about to talk about here. So we will be doing a lot of this stuff in advisory as well. We're going to be incorporating it in there. But point is that a lot of the students that were in spring seminar or at the school during the spring have already created their Naviance accounts, because I handed out those codes at that time. So I even got freshmen at that time. So now the sophomores, those students already have accounts. If your student wasn't there, that's fine. I am more than happy to provide those. But we are really working at it. So the majority, as I said, had it during spring seminar. As soon as November 1st, deadlines are behind us. So this week is really hectic as we're trying to get in some of our early action, early decision applications. But as soon as that's done, I'm really going to start planning some stuff for advisory throughout the year for all grades, not just juniors. And one of the first things is going to be getting kids plugged into Naviance and helping them situate and kind of figure out what it's all about and how they can look up schools and things like that. So it provides access to college data, including past Riverdale acceptances and denials. So if you pull up the college, you can actually see this nice little graph of who got in and who did not get in. You do not see their name, which is key, right? You don't even see what year they graduated. So it's stripped of identifying information. So don't be afraid to put your own information in there when you are a senior. It is completely anonymous, but you're able to see students that got in. Some of the denials are a little bit harder to track because students are less likely to go in and report denials, and I can't make them sit in front of a computer and do it. So generally they're a little bit better about acceptances, but I think the last 2 years, we've been really good about encouraging students to do so, and just how important those denials can be in terms of our information. I'll get to, Eliza, your question here in a second. That's a really good one too. I'll hold off on that. We also upgraded so that we can use resources to help students with their find majors and careers. And this is one of the things I'm really excited about. We were a little fragmented last year in kind of the approaches that were being done. I really think we're, centered around college and those options, but also providing career opportunities for students that aren't interested in that life path, which is good. And Naviance can have us do both now, which is great. One of the things I really like is it has a Myers-Briggs personality assessment. This is something I used to do at the private company I worked at in San Diego. We would do this for all of our students who were applying to college to help them find majors and areas of interest. And it gives it's probably 2 or 3 page write-up of who you are, right? And for many kids, it's the first time they're really asking those types of questions. And towards the end of it, it says, hey, you may be interested in this type of field or this type of field or this type of major, right? Likewise, there's a learning and productivity assessment, talking about how you best learn, whether you're visual or auditory or something like that, and how best to be productive given your personality types. So that doesn't even really have anything to do with college, which will be great. There's a skills assessment there, which again will give some actual career recommendations based around those skills, things that you're generally talented at. And there's an intelligence assessment, and this is not like an intelligence test. It's just talking about the areas in which you have some strengths, like linguistic intelligence or interpersonal or maybe musical and the like there. And again, it will give you kind of targeted recommendations about possible jobs, possible majors, things like that. So anyway, if your student wants to get access to this a little bit earlier, if they weren't at the spring seminar, they just missed that day, right? They're free to send me an email. I can send the registration code. Getting the parents also have accounts. Getting that's a little bit more time intensive. We still have to put in a few parents, I think. It's all manual data entry on that side. So it just takes a little bit longer, but we will have you in as well. So you will be able to go in and explore accounts. You are read only, so you actually can't engage with anything and click and answer questions and stuff like that. But you will be able to actually go in and use the explore function to look at a particular school that you think your student may be interested in. So ways in which you can interact with colleges now. I think this is key. I mean, normally we have colleges coming to the campus constantly during this time. They're not right now. Setting up virtual appointments is it's not too productive in the sense that most students won't come in those events. And then it becomes a question of where, and we're going to have kids on phones. So again, most competitive colleges are steering people to their admissions pages right now. I think they will be back next fall. in doing their tours, but I know from talking with a lot of them that they actually prefer the admission sites right now, and just that engagement. So head to the admissions pages for the college or university. One of the first things to always do is to sign up to receive emails. A lot of times that's request more information and just putting your email in there. And you can use your personal email or your Riverdale email, either or. Then look for those admissions events, those virtual information sessions. They'll do some virtual tours. Sometimes there's a meet your counselor, which is important because it's always first person that's going to read your application. So that can always be a good one. And then there's also, if you go to the events section, you may find some exciting different things. Some schools are doing major specific ones. I just sat in a Purdue engineering one, for instance, last week, which was really good, just talking about what the engineering department is doing and nothing else. So that's always a fun one as well. So visiting the colleges in person is important, but it's by no means necessary. I didn't have a lot of money growing up. I went to all my colleges. I went to one undergrad and 2 graduate schools. And the first time I was on campus was literally when I moved in, right? I had to look through brochures because really online wasn't that big a thing at that time, and kind of see the pictures of the school, right? And same with grad school. I moved to an entirely different country and had never been on the campus, right? Into Scotland. So it is definitely doable. But if you can visit colleges, I do think that it's a worthwhile experience. But I do want you to know that the virtual tours, the information sessions, and the like there, students can make informed decisions based off of that. And I'm very happy with the decisions I made when I was in that place. So virtualcollegefairs.org is a great one. There's going to be a lot of college fair sites, just to be aware. A lot of those are tied with different third-party groups from like student loan providers, or people that want to sell their services to help you find a college. So keep that in mind. The one that I recommend is Virtual College Fairs. It's done through NACA. So it is a nonprofit organization. They're not going to try to sell you anything. And they have events all the time. If you hop on there, I think there's one next week and you're like, I can't go next week. They're going to have one next month. There are so many that are added there all the time. So if you just monitor that, you are going to find some pretty cool events that are going to connect you with different colleges. And one of the things I really liked is look for collaborative events. So especially if you go to the events at one of the schools, sometimes you'll have these anchor institutions. So Oregon has been really good about doing this with a lot of schools. You'll have these anchor institutions, and then they'll also tack on like 3 schools you've never heard about. And then they do this quick presentation with 5 schools of what they're about, what they offer, who they are, and their identity. And it's a great way to find other colleges that you don't even know about. And even if you don't end up liking those colleges, you may find that there's something that you like that you would like to look for in other colleges. So when you see those collaborative events, I really encourage you to go to them if you're interested in just one of the schools, right? Don't just write it off because it's just one and you're not interested in the other 4. Go to them because you could be really, really surprised. And I know several of our seniors have ended up looking at universities because of just those events there. So, and the last little bit here, and then I'll try to answer some questions real quickly. So how many colleges? I'm kind of new school on this. I think that college consultants in some ways who have been around a long time kind of insist on having this very constructed list where you've really researched these universities. And I think that's important, but then they stop you at like 8 or something like that. This day and age, we saw how competitive colleges have gotten. If there are just 8 schools and there are a lot that you really think you're going to get into, that's perfectly fine. I've had students apply just to 2 or 3, and I'm super happy because I knew that they were going to get into them, right? And that's where they felt like they belong. But if you're looking at some of those competitive schools, it may go above that, right? So generally my recommendation was 10 in the past. That may be closer to 12. If you add up everything on there on the right side, it will be closer to 12. So the wild card, as I tell students, is something that you don't think you're going to get into, but you love the school and it's really worth a risk. I will note that 3 kids last year got into their wild cards. The first year I started at Riverdale, when I introduced this category, I was looking at students' applications and they were just applying to places that they were going to get in, like they were going to hear 10 yeses, right? And they were not taking any risks because they were afraid to hear no, right? Really have pressed this, you've got to take a little bit of a risk there. Something that's just outside of your metrics. It is worth it. It does happen. Sometimes it doesn't. And the worst thing is they say no, and you have all these other great schools to apply to. So that wild card for a lot of students will, either be in that sub 20 range or that sub 25% range acceptance rate. For some of our top students, it's that sub 10% range. But everybody should have one regardless of where you are, what your GPA is, and the like there. The reach is just something that's slightly above your metrics. So if you have a 3.5 and their average GPA is a 3.6, for instance, to 3.8, I mean, that's a little bit of a reach at that point. It's definitely worth going for. Riverdale students have incredible recommendations. I think the counselor recommendations are pretty good too. We really put a lot of effort in that, and sometimes it's enough to bridge that gap for kids. So definitely applying to a few schools that are just outside of the range. The match is you look at their metrics and you're a fit. You're right there in the middle. It's a great school for you. You really like it. And then I followed the suit of some other counselors. I'm no longer calling it a safety because I don't know if there are that many safeties anymore. It's better to call it a likely, right? A school that you're pretty positive you're going to get into these days. And having 2 to 3 of those, it's really important to have quality schools there, because if you end up having to go to one of those, you want to make sure that you're happy. And students sometimes will just tack on some stuff there at the end that they know they're going to get into, and they don't put a lot of thought into them. Kids that have put a lot of thought into them, typically those safeties or those likelies are the ones that give more financial aid, that really want you to come there and will incentivize it in some way. I had a student that when I was in San Diego that turned down an Ivy League college for Arizona State University. And Arizona State University was going to cost that student, I think it was like $2,000 for all 4 years. That's how much money the student got there. And so they chose that way instead of the debt of the Ivy Leagues there that their parents were going to have to pay because their EFC was so high. So it is reasonable sometimes. If you don't feel tempted at all by those financial aid offers from those likelies, it's probably not a very good likely at that point. So find some schools that you really love. That's what I'm there to help you with as well, and trying to find that range for you. For many of our students, it's Oregon and Oregon State, and they'll be happy there. And that's perfectly fine, right? But if it's Oregon State, maybe let's find one more, right? Something that you didn't just automatically think of in that situation. So general, I would say 8 to 12 is the range of schools that you're going to be looking for. By February or so, I'd like you to have about 2 or 3, and I'll be there to kind of walk you through some of that decision making using Naviance and the like. But if you can get 2 to 3 by February, we can really start building an incredible list at that point. And students that had already done that are really on top of it right now in terms of applications. Students who drug their feet all the way through the spring are racing right now. So to answer a few of the questions real quickly, so the advanced physics class, I highly recommend it for students that have that strong math backgrounds, regardless of whether it is necessarily the AP score that is going to go onto the application to help your students. It's just showing that you're embracing challenge, right? That will likely make the school profile at some point as one of those rigorous classes that we offer. So yeah, calculus-based physics is something that I've been advocating that we need for a really long time. I really like that we have a teacher that can do it now and that really is passionate about doing it. You should hear him talk about it. It's incredible. And so yeah, I highly, highly, highly recommend it for kids that have that strong math background. And if it's not this year, next year, I mean, hopefully we're offering it as senior year as well. So I don't think that this is your only option by any stretch. We talked about honors with GPA. So we do not weight GPAs. This is clearly stated in the school profile. It's clearly stated in the school report that I send. Some schools will re-weight GPAs. They'll go through and add the honors and actually give you a bump if they want to. Most schools now have resorted to what's holistic review. They consider you within the context of what your school offers. And that's where that GPA data and the comparison points with you and other students kind of takes precedence. So that's the stuff that they're really working out there. So I would not worry about the weighted, unweighted. If you apply to, for instance, a public school in Massachusetts, they're required by law to reweight everybody. So you can go to like UMass and find calculators to figure out what your GPA is there. Dartmouth has the same thing, right? So some schools will do it that way. It's really up to them, but we don't wait. And then the UC's application is going to be interesting as test blind, right? Until they can introduce their own testing, I would imagine is still the ultimate goal there. It's interesting that they decided to go completely against the faculty. The faculty was unanimous in their faculty vote for standardized testing. They decided they weren't going to go that route. They are still looking at AP tests. So I think that that's important. I spoke to Berkeley specifically at NACAC and asked them if that was going to be a factor in their decision. So if your student's doing advanced calculus or other AP coursework, that will show up, and that can be one of those tests. So we're actually going to be sending out the registration codes, I think tomorrow, either tomorrow or Monday, for AP tests, with an invitation that if you're interested in one, come talk with me or talk with a relevant teacher there. So if your student is kind of eyeing that stuff, I work with a lot of students on AP English language. We had 2 students that did it this year and both got 4s, which are great scores. The year before, we had 2 4s and a 5, which is great. So I know the test really well, so I'm happy to work with students on that. It does require a lot of work, though. I mean, it's not something easy that you can just do in addition to your coursework. You're gonna have to work for it. So keep that in mind. And the new leadership option is a great course, especially it's one of the things that they're really looking for in terms of attributes for students is leadership. When they asked you to list your extracurriculars, you're actually asked, did you have a leadership position in this? And so I do think that, the leadership course, I don't know, I haven't talked a ton about it because I've been kind of fixated on seniors right now. But I think one of the advantages there is that it's encouraging you to get out and do things, right? And in that sense, that stuff's going to be incredible, right? I think the opportunities that could create there are things that could be really important when you were kind of telling your story and who you are and what you're passionate about and the like there. So yeah, it's great class. Sometimes there's too many great classes and you have to choose too, right? So go with your interests. How would I go about applying to the National Honor Society? That's a very good question. I would probably say right now, ask Cheryl Wright on this one. Obviously Wechter's absence kind of left this glut there, and it was being filled. I think it has been filled. That is one of the things I think that the leadership class is going to be targeting there is some of the stuff for NHS and the like there as well. But I can ask her tomorrow too if you want to just shoot me an email to remind me who's actually spearheading that, because we do need to get it up again. I've been saying that for a bit. I think we were just waiting on the start of our new principal. So, other questions? Is there an optimal number of AP test students should attempt for college admissions? Too many. If you're at an AP school, probably there's not such a thing as too many. With our school, I'll say this: I think both of our Stanford acceptances, all of our Ivy League acceptances, they had 0 AP tests, right? So it's not like this is somehow like a magic ingredient that's going to get your kid into school, right? I would say the majority of the students who got accepted to the elite schools for the past 2 years did not have a single AP test under their belt. So should you take one? Yeah, right. I mean, I think it's a good opportunity, especially if you have a teacher that's doing like AP Calc, right? With Preacher, or if advanced physics is going to be targeting that. That would be a good one. I saw Lori Shalek, you had a hand up. Maybe it was a mistake. All right. But yeah, I know a majority of our students that are applying don't have them. I think that's changed slightly now this year, especially because of the fact that I've been pushing it a little bit more. And so typically they'll have one or two, especially with calculus there if they've done that junior year or AP English. But we had students that self-studied. We had a student that self-studied for computer science, taught himself the entire class on his own and got a 4. It's absolutely incredible. So yeah, it can help, but think of it as icing on the cake. It's not necessarily a requirement. So, any other questions? I'm gonna log off here in probably 6 minutes. You don't know I have an 8-week-year-old, so got to get to her and then find out what the Dodgers are doing. They're probably breaking my heart. Any other questions though? Well, is that 6-2 Dodgers or is that 6-2? I'll find out. Maybe okay. All right. It's been a nightmare. So anyway, other questions though. I'm hoping at being junior classes too in November sometime, maybe early December if it comes to that. It's great. I think we're really ahead in terms of our senior applications, even with COVID. We're going to have a really strong EA early application pool there, and so that's going to allow me to turn my attention to other things, which is great. That's what I really want to do, and really start building this out for the rest of the year for your class. So one of the biggest things I want to emphasize is, I really have combed through all transcripts and things like that before the start of the year. The class is incredible, and I think that everybody has really an opportunity to go to a really great university. Everybody can go to 4-year if they really want to, right? It's just about taking ownership of this moment, right, and pushing and getting those grades in and adapting back to that in-person environment. So, any other questions? I'm available for a meeting as soon as November 1st passes, so maybe giving me an extra day, and then we can start setting up some meetings with junior families. I'm more than happy to connect with you all on a more personal level and answer questions specific to your child. So, always an option there. All right, well, thank you for coming. Everybody take care and go Dodgers.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.